Welcome to Tracing Your Family Roots. I'm Chuck Mason, and with me today is a familiar guest, Arline Sachs, who Arline was the host of the show for many, many years, along with Sally Ann. And today we're going to talk about something that, fortunately, I don't have too much of a problem with, because most of my ancestors came from countries that spoke and wrote English, although sometimes handwriting is a problem. But we're going to talk about translating and understanding translated documents. So Arline did something kind of unique. I think most people get a document or two translated. She translated a whole book. Why would you do that?
Actually, I have to give my son credit. He's the one that did the actual work. And he couldn't be here, so I'm talking about it, but he's the one that did it. I have to go back to when I first started genealogy in order to understand what I've been doing. But back when I started genealogy, I got an obituary, and that obituary was of my great-great-grandfather, and I thought they were going to show a slide of it. There it goes. And it said that my great-great-grandfather was descendant from a Rabbi Hirsch. And I was absolutely thrilled with this idea. This was something new. And not only that, he had been condemned as a witch and spent 24 years in prison. So I figured I have to find out more about this person. And I did. I was able to, and the obituary also said that they had written an article, a long article about that rabbi a few years back. I was able to find the entire article at the Library of Congress. And I think that's something I want to point out too, that the Library of Congress has a whole bunch of stuff that you would never imagine they'd have. An 1868 newspaper article. And that's the column heading that's on the screen now. And what it says is "The Prisoner, the true story as told by the hero himself," and reported by E. Carmely. That E. Carmely was the author. A true story. I believed it, as did many other people, especially because Bernard Kahn kept diaries, and I had the diaries, and Bernard Kahn noted in them when he gave papers to Carmely to write the article.
And one of the things I want to point out with the Library of Congress, Ben, you mentioned it, one of the great things about their website is up on the homepage on the right-hand side, there's a place that says Ask the Librarian. Click on that, it gives you the listing of the various rooms, and you can ask the librarian about things, so it often saves you the time of going down there and finding out, no, they don't have something, or you have to order it ahead of time. It's going to take a couple of days to get it.
Since you mentioned that, last June, my son called me up excitedly. He says, guess what, the Library of Congress has an article relating to the trial of Hirsch Frankel, but it's not online. I said, well, I told him to do exactly that, to go to Ask a Genealogist, and we were leaving town at 11 o'clock, at 12 o'clock. At 11 o'clock, we're sitting in the airport, and he had a copy of it.
Yeah.
It had not been put online yet, but obviously when somebody asked for it, they pushed it to the top of the line.
If it's a relatively short thing, they will do that.
It was quite a few pages. It was much longer than I would have thought, but they're really good on that now.
So you found the article. Could you believe everything in the article?
It made a lot of sense. It mentioned his wife. It mentioned his two children, and others believed this as well. There's a man called Henley who wrote about him in a book about the history of Jews of that area. He mentioned the Jewish Encyclopedia of 1908 mentions it. Something called the Forgotten Fragments of Family. Frankel family mentioned it. And of course, I used that information in my own book. The French genealogy had, again, the same information published a few years back. And even a 1993 Hebrew article. all used this information, and mainly because he had 2 sons.
And did it turn out to be true?
Well, as far as we knew, and I have a 6th cousin, Isaac, and he was doing some other research in Germany. I don't know what particularly he was researching, but he found an article that quoted the son of Hirsch Fraenkel. But wait, it wasn't. It was at the trial. Isaac found a Nazi note, and then the note article. The name translates to a court Jew and the chief rabbi of Franconia. And what they had done is take this very, very anti-Semitic article and tried to make out all Jews were magicians and they were bad, et cetera, et cetera. But the point is that they quoted this son who spoke at the trial, but it wasn't the son that Isaac is descended from. And we know he's descended from the son, and I'm descended from this man's daughter. So he really got busy on it, and he had to do, he did a lot more research.
Well, I know that you can read German and have translated a number of things in the past. You know, could you read all of the German that you were dealing with?
Well, actually, Isaac wrote in Hebrew.
Ah.
And I don't know Hebrew, but he really wanted this book published in Germany, in the area in which this all happened, with southern Germany. There's a picture on the slide of the book, and that funny little drawing on it is actually something that Hirsch Fraenkel had done when he was only 14 years old. And it's a book on mysticism. He was an early Kabbalist. Kabbalists are those that believe in mysticism, reading things in different ways. As far as translating it, I could read some of it, but I got very bogged down in the court proceedings and court names. They were words that weren't even in either of my dictionaries. I have a modern dictionary. I have a very old German dictionary. But I got out of it what I wanted. And
so then how did you said that some of it was in Hebrew. How did you get the Hebrew translated?
I tried for a number of years at international conferences. The International Association of Jewish Genealogical Societies has a German SIG, special interest group. And I did try for many years to ask somebody, please translate this. I know there have to be other people descended from them, because by that time we knew he had 8 children, not the 2, and so on. So I've got to explain, my son wasn't terribly interested in genealogy in and of itself, but he was a great Harry Potter fan, and suddenly he realized, well, gee, if he's descended from a magician, then he isn't. Then anyway, that's what he says. That sort of piqued his interest, and that's how he got interested in it.
You know, we find that, you know, oftentimes we're interested in genealogy, but the rest of the family, the eyes glaze over. And, you know,
well, he's been very, very interested in what I did and what my results were, but not interested in doing anything.
And sometimes even in a lot of the details and things.
Well,
so.
Yeah, but he used 3 different websites, and I think Do It in Hebrew was the first, a major one that he used. He also used Google Translate and Bing Translate.
Okay.
And I think the important thing to realize here is that even though I'm talking about Hebrew at this point, this will hold into any other language that you can translate. I understand, and I haven't looked at it in detail, that Google Translate can handle 100 different languages.
Yeah.
So there's quite a few, and the point is that you can do it yourself.
Well, and I know the Family History Library out in Salt Lake's website also has, at least for basic words and things, a translation in some languages. I don't know how many.
Those kind of things I think are like birth and marriage and circumcision or baptism, the common things that you find on most vital records. Let's take a look at what happened when he, or how he did it. If we can get us, on the top left-hand corner of this slide, you can see some Hebrew. And what he did is did a cut and paste from the Hebrew. Isaac, I should say that Isaac had sent him a digital version of the book. We don't have a hard copy of it. And then the two columns that you see towards the right is the Hebrew and the equivalent English. I want to talk about Hirsch Frankel, which is the name that he's circled there.
So what?
Hirsch the word Hirsch in German also means deer.
Okay.
And the Hebrew version of it is tzvi. And Isaac had this way of writing. He always used the combination of tzvi Hirsch.
Okay.
So you can look at the bottom line if you can read it, and it translates it to the dear Frankel instead of Hirsch Frankel.
Okay.
So it didn't realize Hirsch was a name. Translated it to deer. Tzvi is again deer. I laughed when I saw that one because that is a name that I've come across in my genealogy.
And Herschel just happens to be one of my father's brothers and also one of my grandfather's brothers. So, you know, were you having difficulties? I mean, I understand that sometimes languages can be a problem, but handwriting itself can also be a problem. Did you have a problem with the handwriting for the most part?
No, this was all printed.
All
it was
printed.
a printed, published book in Israel. But there's another example. It came up with breadwinner, chief breadwinner. And after looking at for a while and knowing what the person did, it turned out it was a community leader. And that's the way he ended up translating it. So sometimes, yes, the words, if you take the individual words, don't make sense, but if you take them in the context, you begin to understand what's written there.
Yeah, I've found oftentimes that, you know, reading along, you have to look at context, and sometimes you even have to look up the meaning of the individual words, particularly when you're dealing with legal documents and things like that, because I found, you know, when I got into reading documents from court records, and it's like, okay, well, I knew this about the word and the meaning, but it didn't quite make sense in the context of the document. So that's why I say now, you really need to go read the entire document, or the entire meeting rather, so that you understand it in the context of the document.
Yeah, if we have time, I'll give you another example of that. We have another example of, besides that chief breadwinner, of the word margrave. Now he looked this word up in I'll do it in Hebrew, and in one paragraph, it came up with all of these different possibilities. So, you know, a margrave is not a word that's used much. It sort of means like a duke. It was the head of a principality, a head of an area, and it's just not a word that you would use even in German very much. It doesn't. So that's why it had so much trouble. And there's one other one that he really couldn't figure out, and it shows the Hebrew there and the word, and it kept translating it as the princess of something. But he knew there was no princess, there was no child of that particular duke. And so he finally realized it meant principality. But whether the Hebrew word is the same or it just might be that they would use the same word for Hebrew in Hebrew.
Well, and of course, you know, like we've talked about before, you know, words are used for time periods, but then they go away. People don't use them and all like they used to. And so
you looked at the word carriage or the different words for a horse and buggy.
Yeah, there's so many of them that you can
nobody
come up
knows
with.
them what they are today.
Yes, and of course one of the things that I found with terminology, like I said, as far as understanding it, you know, I was finding documents and it kept talking about an infant, I kept looking at things, and finally, these kids have got to be 10, 12 years old. So I pulled out the Black's Law Dictionary and found out infant was a term used for any child under the age of majority, which basically was 18 for females and 21 for males. And so, again, that terminology has changed in the way we use it, because I think of an infant as, a child under 2 years old max. So was there anything that he didn't understand in?
Yeah, there's a couple of examples where he knew he had done the translation absolutely correctly.
Correct.
And one that we really thought was weird was half of a wax. Those who ignore the regulations and enter through the men's entrance, their husbands would be fined half of a wax. What in the world could that mean? Well, it turns out that if you go back to Orthodox Jews today, most of in an Orthodox synagogue, the men and the women do not sit together. In many cases, the women are up on a balcony, if there is a balcony. Otherwise, they sit on the side. In this case, they seem to have gone a step further, and they had a totally separate door that the women could answer. You didn't want to get a man excited when he was supposed to be prayer, so they weren't supposed to be any women around.
Well, and I know when the first time I went to a synagogue, we were invited as Boy Scouts to one of our troop members' synagogue to the Friday night service. And if I remember right, the women all sat in the back and the men sat in the front of.
There was an Orthodox synagogue then.
Synagogue.
Because we certainly don't do that. But what he couldn't figure out was the half a wax, and he did some other reading, and as near as we could tell is that it's the amount of wax needed to light the synagogue for a certain period of time. And we don't know whether it's just for a service or whether it's the whole Sabbath, that you'd have to light the candles in the morning and let them burn all day. But that's what the half of a wax sounds is for.
So, what were some of the conclusions that you came to after?
Well, some of the things that he wrote about, that he found as a result of this translation, and this is Isaac's work, so, don't give us the credit for it. First of all, the article talked about a very, very early family going back to 1500. And although we can't prove it's not true, we can't prove it is true. So Isaac said, there's just, it talks about a convert, it talks about all sorts of things. Probably not. One of the things that I had and that all of the other articles then used is that he used the name Clara as Hirschfrankel's wife. Her name is Riesler. Okay. And actually, I had seen Riesler's death mentioned in, there's a book called Eli Toldot, which exists in Leo Baeck Institute in New York and in Israel, and I think in Frankfurt, and lists all of the deaths in the city of Frankfurt from 1200 on. But it's handwritten, or it's typed, but it's really weird. But it lists her and 8 children. But I figured that was a mistake because this article was absolutely the truth. I just believed this article. I didn't pay attention to it. Isaac also found that the tower where he was imprisoned wasn't there. There were towers around the town where he was imprisoned, but the one that flooded was not a prison. The one where they had the prison was a different tower. And supposedly he was released when there was a flood so that he wouldn't be drowned. And there's no flood in the year that there was a flood, but it's not in the year that he was released. So, and they do have the records of when he was released. They can tell that. He found those. He stayed with a family member, but that family member didn't live in the town where the article says the family lived. As I said, Hirschfrankel had 8 children, not 2 children. So that's why I think I've really been interested in getting this published as in English, because I think there's a lot of people that are descended. By the time somebody has 8 children, and they did scatter, he mentioned where, we know that 2 of them went, or at least one of them went to France, and that's where I'm descended from. Isaac's family's been in Israel for over 100 years. We know that some went to Poland, so they're all over the place. And then it also said where he was buried, and it says Gemund. It's possibly Gorgesmund. I don't know where either one of those are, but there is no town or no record of his burial, which is also very possible because by the time he died, he was a pauper. I mean, they had taken everything from him. They took everything from his wife. His wife also died as a pauper.
Well, and that happens here. I have a great-grandfather that was buried in the Pauper's Field, and they have they know about where the cemetery is, but it's now been built over.
Oh, the cemetery's been built over.
Built over, yeah, and they have no records of the people. Those have been lost over time, and we're just talking about somebody that died in 1881.
Yeah.
So, but you know, the number of generations, I think you may very well find that it is many generations, because we're talking the 1500s here.
Well, no, he died in 1740.
1740. Well, even 1740, you figure the number of generations coming down from that.
Well, the thing is, unlike many Christian cemeteries, which are reused, especially in Europe, we've seen them. After 20 years or so, then unless you continuously pay for upkeep, they're taken out or reused or somehow.
Yeah.
Jewish cemeteries generally are not. It's not allowed. But there is no sign of them anywhere at this point. And of course, many of the cemeteries were destroyed in the Holocaust anyway. So even if it had been there, 40 years ago or 70 years ago.
Well, and even, markers, depending on what they're made of, deteriorate. I remember as a kid, about 16, my third great-grandparents' marker, and it was a table marker. You could read the marker completely, and it had something in the middle, and I don't remember. I think it may have been a Bible verse. Today, you go up there to the cemetery, and you can barely make out their names and their dates of birth and
I hope you've done a sketch, whatever they call it, the thing where you put a paper down. And
I have tried, but by the time I got into genealogy and went back, it had deteriorated that I've tried doing a rubbing, and it's just too deteriorated.
What about the picture, a photo?
I've got photographs of it, and I have translations that there are multiples of this cemetery. The problem is the people only copied down the names, the dates, and the relationships. They didn't copy that whole thing in the center. So, that's the 1800s when they were buried. So 1700s, depending on the material, it can deteriorate.
Bernard Kahn, who we've talked about, when I go to see his daughter died in 1877, and I've seen the tombstone, I said, oh, there's some moss growing on there, and I just barely touched it. And it flecked off. It was like a red sandstone, and you could just see the layers peeling off. It would have been a very, very beautiful tombstone.
Yes.
150 years ago, but there's just you can't touch it, you can't clean it.
Yeah, I think that unless they're a really hard stone.
Granite is really better than marble.
Yeah.
Marble wears more than
marble deteriorates. A lot of them were sandstone and things like that, which are much softer and going to deteriorate. So we have just a couple of minutes left. Is there anything that we haven't covered?
Well, I think I want to point out the importance that you can translate something. Yes, there are a lot of sites where somebody will help you or somebody will translate for you. But if you did have something longer, chances are they're not going to be willing to translate a longer thing for you, but you can do it if you've got the will and you really want to know it bad enough. And that you can do it. The other thing that I want to mention is we were talking about tombstones. There's a lot of specialized symbols on tombstones, too, that indicate a watering can or a candelabra, right. the menorah, the hands for somebody that's Kohanim and Jewish. I don't know the other ones.
Yeah, there are lots of them, particularly in the New England area. That was very popular to have symbols carved on to the tombstones.
And that tells you what kind of profession often the person was in, and gives you a little bit more information about it. I guess they did that because not everybody could talk, maybe. Could read.
Read, yes. And there is an organization called the Association of Gravestone Studies. We didn't think about getting the address, but if you do an internet search, that comes up, and they have a lot of information on there. And speaking of information, we do want to thank the Mount Vernon Genealogical Society, who is our sponsor, and Janelle couldn't be with us, but they have a very interesting library down there. Lots of things. It's packed full of things, and just unusual things that you don't necessarily expect in a small library, plus computers that you can use, and it is free for the public to go down.
You have to make an appointment, though. They're not open every day.
Well, they're open Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays from 10 to 2 now.
Oh, okay.
And
so
they have more than when you visited there. So, and we're done.
Well, I hope this helps people a little bit.
I think it's interesting, and I think it will be helpful.